Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to our webinar, Overcoming Challenges to Effectively Using Data in Rural Schools. We've been very excited about this webinar. We have a lot of folks who've been interested, over 60 people who've registered, representing more than 15 states. And what's also interesting is that folks who've signed up for this webinar are not just in universities or research organizations, we do have those, but also schools, middle schools, high schools, school districts, and then also community-based organizations, education programs, education service districts. So a wide variety of folks and organizations who are really interested in this topic. So welcome, everyone. I'd like to say just a couple things about our technical platform here. I think most everyone is probably familiar with the WebEx platform. Everyone but the presenters are muted, so I'd like to remind the presenters to silence your phones and your computers unless you want everyone to know that you've got lots of email coming in. And for the participants, I'd like to encourage you all, if you have any questions or technical issues, to communicate using the comment window. And we have a wonderful production associate, Andy Clark, who will respond to you also through the comment window. In the second half of our hour today, we will have a question and answer session with our presenters. So I invite you all to type your questions into the Q&A window, that screen, and not just at the end of the presentation, but really throughout the webinar. And we will come to those when our Q&A time comes up. All right. This is to put a face to a voice. My name is Nettie Legters, and I'm with REL Northwest, the organization that is sponsoring the webinar. And REL Northwest is one of the 10 regional education labs, or RELs, that's funded through the Institute for Education Sciences in the U.S. Department of Education. The purpose of the REL system is really to link research to practice and practice to research so that we can together really build our understanding of reliable and actionable evidence that can inform decision-making and help improve student outcomes. One of the main ways that we and our sister RELs do this is by creating working alliances with policymakers and practitioners in our states. We in REL Northwest currently have 8 alliances across our 5-state region. This webinar was particularly inspired by our Montana Data Use Alliance, where we work with the State Department of Education in Montana and really any district, school district in the state that wants to join, with the purpose of strengthening the use of data in education systems, and not just strengthening the use of data because someone thinks that that's a good idea or someone said you should do that, but really in our kind of collective purpose and service of improving dropout prevention efforts and improving high school graduation rates across the state. You know, many of the school systems in Montana and throughout the Northwest and across the country are rural. So this afternoon, we're going to take a closer look at how rural school systems are using data in remote settings where adults wear many hats and operate on constrained budgets. So our goals for the webinar are to share success strategies and learn from our presenters who bring a ton of knowledge and experience in this area. We also want to know what your questions are so we can share with each other. So again, I encourage you throughout the presentation to type your questions into the question and answer box. And we'll address as many of those as we can after we hear from the presenters. And here are our presenters. Dr. Tina Versland is going to lead us off. Tina is an assistant professor and program leader in the education leadership at Montana State University in Bozeman, Montana. She also served for 30 years in teaching and leadership roles in public schools in Montana and received the Outstanding School Improvement and Performance Award from the Office of Public Instruction in Montana 3 years in a row when she was a school principal from 2009 to 2012. So pretty impressive. After Tina has set us up with some of the research on data use in rural settings, we'll have the opportunity to hear from Dr. Randy Trainey. Randy is a superintendent of Corbett Schools in Corbett, Oregon. Under his leadership as a high school principal and then superintendent in Corbett, Randy's district has become nationally recognized for student achievement. Corbett schools are consistently rated in the top 10 or top 20 in the United States, and Randy himself has received numerous professional awards, including Oregon High School Principal of the Year in 2007. Randy's also just amazing. He's authored 2 books, Built to Fail and Fallacies in Education, which I encourage everyone to check out. After Randy's presentation, Tina is going to return to share a little bit of the work that she and her colleagues and partners are doing in Montana, working with small schools on collaborative data literacy development. So without further ado, I'm going to pass the ball to Tina, who's going to set us up with some of the research.
Thanks, Nettie. Thank you for having me. To begin with, research is pretty clear about what works in data analysis strategies. First of all, we know that a school-wide vision about data use is really paramount to creating a culture of data literacy within a school or district. And in that school-wide vision, the leader involvement is critical. And it's not just leader involvement when we think about finding financial resources to make data literacy happen. It's really the learning and the doing, the side-by-side work that leaders do with teachers. We know, too, that collaborative data analysis allows us to have a deeper and more focused conversation about data and school improvement efforts. Also, something that works to promote this culture is that we need to have ongoing and cyclical data-driven decision-making kinds of work and efforts. That needs to be done often and become a regular part of the school schedule throughout the year. Another interesting thing is that we know that visual displays of data, whether they're in data walls in the principal's office or whether they're visual displays that teachers use in the classroom, we know that that creates a greater sense of urgency for people to look at data and actually do something about it. Those visual representations are very important in creating action. Lastly, we know that students analyzing their own work skills improves what they're doing in the classroom. It helps create a classroom culture of students who take more responsibility for their learning. It also improves their math skills and their critical thinking skills when they can work on analyzing their own data and keep track of their own learning. So why are there problems with small schools in terms of data analysis? First off, I think common to many schools lack expertise to analyze data. When we think about things that happened before NCLB, many of our teachers who were prepared in programs had no idea about the quality and the quantity of data analysis they were going to have to do. And so really there were no preparation programs that emphasized anyone's use of data. New teachers often are very focused on discipline issues or strengthening their own content knowledge and don't have time to think about data. But what they don't really realize is that sometimes the answer to those questions that they may have relative to discipline or content really are kind of buried in that data. Another issue with data analysis in small schools, we know that small school leaders and rural school leaders wear a lot of hats. And making data analysis, it's a lower priority for them because unlike big schools, small school superintendents and principals are doing the work of sometimes 4 and 5 people that would do that same kind of work in a larger school. One last issue is that sometimes leaders are very unsure of what to do with data. And so therefore, they collect and they collect and they collect data without analyzing it. And they know they need to do something, so just collecting more data seems to be what they do, and they kind of hope that magically some answer will become clear and straightforward to guide them to what to do next. So from the research in terms of what we need to do to overcome these challenges about data analysis in rural schools, first of all, we have to realize that the time has to become our ally. We have to allocate time purposefully for regular data analysis, not only within the classrooms, but across the school and across the district. This has to be done, this has to be a part of our school schedule. It has to be built in the year before as we're scheduling things, as we're making plans for our early release days or our times out of school. We have to keep this continually at the forefront. The leader has to have a huge involvement in pre-planning professional development time. They have to be the ones who basically determine, okay, what is it that we hope to accomplish today, and how do I, as the leader, help make this happen? Who do I go to? How do I leverage support from other teachers? That has to be very, very well planned out, and it has to be a very specific kind of thing that we're looking for. Common planning time kind of goes to the first bullet as well. That's very helpful in making sure that data analysis becomes a habit and not a once-a-year activity. And I think a huge benefit to overcoming challenges would be to really help people understand that analyzing data as a group activity is not only fun, but it helps a ton in just trying to figure out, what are our kids doing? What are my kids doing? It's a great activity. We have a lot of perspectives. It elicits better questions and a more wide-ranging set of solutions when data analysis is done as a group activity.
Great, thank you, Tina, for setting us up. Tina, would you mind if I asked you a quick question before we move on to Randy?
Absolutely.
So I'm curious about a cultural piece. In small rural schools, staff really know their students well just through daily interaction, in school and in the community. Why would you say that they need to spend time with data? What's the added value for them and the students?
You know what, I think that's a great question, because we do, as we travel around Montana in our group and visit with small schools, we do hear that come up. And I guess my thought is, I think it's really easy for us to get comfortable and to make assumptions about what a student can or can't do. And a lot of times we base that on previous performance. So we sort of prejudge, in a sense, what students are capable of doing. And so I think when we look at data, we don't necessarily look at it in a very objective kind of manner. So I think there's value in that. And, in the sense of in small schools, if other teachers, we can look at this data from a collaborative sense, and other teachers can look at our own data, they might see something that we miss, some kind of a pattern, something that we didn't notice. They may be able to relate it to something that's going on in their classroom. I just think it offers us a chance to have a greater range of solutions to all the issues that go on in schools.
Right. Yeah, that's terrific, just to be able to get past assumptions and really approach work with the lens of inquiry, asking questions every day. Awesome. At this time, we're going to pass the ball to Randy Trainey, who's going to talk with us about the work in his district, starting out with absurd aspirations. Randy?
Thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me. and I'll try to move quickly. I'm trying to describe a 12-year process here, and we're really kind of looking at summative data at the end, and I'll try to highlight some of the data we used along the way getting here. I do believe strongly in absurd aspirations, and we heard Tina say something like that. You need a school-wide vision and data to back up that school-wide vision. This is a picture of my daughter, Aurora, 3 years ago when I gave her that puppy for her birthday. I want to give her everything. I want to give her every choice possible, and I think a way to do that is through a college education. So that led to my absurd aspiration that I want every single kid from Corbett School District to have the opportunity to go to college. And it resonates with a quote from John Dewey that says, those of us with the most have to want for all kids what we want for our own. So if I want that for Aurora and if I want it for her brother Zach, I should want it for every one of my students. So our absurd aspirations all centered around this idea of going to college. We had to analyze what we were doing, and we looked at our data. We were a typical small rural high school with 200 kids trying to be comprehensive and do everything. The data showed that we were doing everything poorly. For 3 years in a row, we were the lowest performing high school in the state in mathematics and nearly the lowest in English for our high school students. So a benchmark of getting kids into college for me 12 years ago was the AP program, Advanced Placement Program. I had the then absurd aspiration that I would get every kid to take 2 advanced placement courses before they graduated. We had never had more than 5 students out of the 200 take an AP course. So that was a huge reach. Now the average student in Corbett graduates with about 11 advanced placement courses. So I had to change my aspiration. My new absurd aspiration is we have a 100% on-time graduation rate, 100% college acceptance, and that college will be 100% paid for. I'm not sure how I will get to 100% paid for, but I wasn't sure how I'd get to every kid taking 2 AP classes. So I encourage everyone to set your own absurd aspirations. They may not be college like mine was. I'm pretty sure if we had decided to be the best ag school in the state of Oregon, we probably could have been. So just take a moment and reflect on what absurd aspiration you might be able to set for your students. When you set absurd aspirations, you're going to meet barriers. You have to figure out how to jump over those hurdles or around them or under them, and one way was to look at data and predict what barriers we might be facing. We did that reasonably well sometimes, and sometimes we were caught off guard. One barrier we have as a rural school is money and resources. Corbett is actually one of the lowest funded school districts in the state, and so that has always been a barrier. Another barrier that we face, and I've seen in rural districts, is that good enough feel. Like, well, we're good enough. We're good enough. You get that from parents and other community members, and that's a hard one. Sometimes it takes the face of that school learning and community resistance. I've seen that in some of the rural districts I've worked at. Staff hierarchy and staff support were barriers that we had to get across. We were dramatically changing the model from a comprehensive school where we tried to do everything to a very focused school where we were only preparing for college prep. And if everybody was going to take an AP class, that meant everybody was an AP teacher, and staff hierarchy kind of disappeared. Like, the brand new teacher got to teach the smart kids as well as the person who'd been here for 15 years. And we had to use data to convince people that that was the right thing to do. The same thing with student choice and access. We have a mantra that we say we gladly take choices away from 14, 15, 16, and 17-year-olds to give choices to 18, 19, 20, and 21-year-olds. We had to use a lot of data to convince children and their parents that our idea was the better idea because it was going to give them more choices. The last one is you have to be able to say no to good ideas. People are constantly trying to get you to add to your program, and they might be things that are very reasonable and good, but I really, really believe on a very focused approach. Our biggest hurdle, or the biggest barrier that we face, are belief systems. There is a strong belief system that I like to compare to fishing in Alaska, that's where I'm from, that for the top-end courses, you only let your best and your brightest fish into those courses. So the great big king salmons that are swimming around all of our schools, they get to be in AP Calculus and they get to be in AP Lit, and they're the ones who are going to college. It took a lot of work and a lot of mining of data and presenting it to lots of different people to switch that belief system in Corbett to, no, every fish gets these opportunities. The spawned out ones, the little ones, the great big ones, every one of them. So each of you will have different barriers, and I think that you need to think about what those barriers are going to be, what those hurdles are going to be, and then try to, focus on being the very best that you can be by getting across those barriers. One way, I've mentioned a couple times, that we got across the barriers was using data. And so I'm going to show you some data, and this is, a culmination of 12 years worth of data. So here's some about AP pass rates. We had to change what people meant when we talked about AP pass rates. Most schools will say that they have an AP pass rate of, say, 75, 80% in their AP English class. And then if I tell you that Corbett has a pass rate of 48% in our AP English class, it would be pretty easy to say, well, which one is better? Most people would say, well, the other schools are much better. We've changed how we look at that bit of data. We try to talk about production rate versus passing rate. In a normal school, you might have 3,000 students, 3 sections of AP, 75 students in the class, so they're filtering pretty heavily into the classroom. And then they filter even more at the door to the testing room. So not all the kids who took the class take the test. And then 30 of those 40 get a 3 or higher, and they say their passing rate is 75%, but really it's 30 out of 3,000, they have a production rate of 1%. At Corbett, we have 400 students now in the high school. We've doubled in size, 7 sections of AP English, 200 kids take it, 200 take the test, 96 earn a 3, so our passing rate is 48, but our production rate is 24%, or 24 times that of the other model. That kind of data can convince people. Here's data that I would share each year, and you're going to see all 12 years worth of the data at one time. This is the number of AP tests that we took over time. Before 2003 and 2004, we only let our very biggest fish, our best and brightest, take the test. They had a cumulative passing rate of about 50%, and so these are all of our gifted and talented kids. We never took more than 10 tests in one year. Starting in 04, 05, I just started expanding how many kids took it. I used data to convince teachers and parents that it was a good idea. Things like their PSAT score and their state test scores, showing that, hey, this kid's scores match up with these other kids and they aren't in the class, so let's put them in the class. So for those first 3 years of 04 through 07, we went up to 250 students, 250 tests given in that third year, and our passing rate was still 50%. I kept looking at the data and I decided that we couldn't continue to keep being comprehensive and offer all of these different versions of English, for instance, so we're all going to take AP English. That was a huge sell to lots of people. You can see that it kind of mushroomed. Like once we got people convinced that they could pass AP English Lit or AP English Language, suddenly the government class came on board, the human geography class, world history. It's just kind of gone crazy now. You go to the next slide. Here's a different way to look at those same results, and I would share it with people over time. The purple bar represents the number of incompletes that our students earned. Back then in 03, 04, the average student earned 3 out of 7 courses as an incomplete, which is anything below a 70%. And no one was taking any AP courses. As we increased our AP rate, our number of incompletes dropped. So now we're at our lowest incomplete rate ever. It's less than 0.3%, so a 10-fold drop over that many years. And we hover between 2.5 and 3 AP tests per year per student. Our college entrance rate is higher than ever at more than 80%. We have more than 1,000 out-of-district applicants for our district now. People will commute quite a ways to get to little rural Corbett. Each year, more than 25% of our student body are AP scholars, and last year they earned over $750,000 in college credit. Each year, about 40% of our student body passes one or more AP tests. We have more than 20 AP state and national scholars. We pass more tests per student than anybody else in Oregon attempts per student. And by the time they graduate in a typical year, about 3/4 of the kids have taken an AP test. Have passed an AP test. You can see that we group our SAT data together over time in 5-year increments. In 91 through 95, only about 1/3 of our kids took the AP test, and then it dropped off to 25%. And we were scoring, in the bottom quartile, basically. Now, more than 85% have taken the SAT during the last 5-year period, and the average score is in the 67th percentile. Actually, now it's 100% of the kids take the SAT in Corbett. We give it to them both as a junior and a senior. So, in summary, I'm encouraging everybody to focus on some single factor, set some absurd aspiration, identify the hurdles that you're going to have to jump over or dig under or plow your way through to get those absurd aspirations, collect and share data to overcome those hurdles, and that's the important part. I think we're going to have time for questions and answers at some point.
Yes, that's right. In fact, Randy, if you're all right with this, I'd like to ask you a quick question before we pass the ball back to Tina.
Sure.
So I think when we were talking about the progress in your school and one of the ways of overcoming the hurdles, you were talking a little bit about making the data visible in the school, and there's a wall of data in your office. So we're curious about, what data is up on that wall and how frequently is it refreshed, and are there any personal information issues that you had to address in order to display it in your office?
Yeah. Well, one thing Tina said, the visual display of data. My office is a giant office filled with all kinds of charts and graphs. There's not very much text in front of people when they walk in. It's all colors, and that really resonated when Tina talked about that. I have data hanging up in front of me about AP pass rates, PSAT, SAT, our state test scores, our transfer rate in, our transfer rate out. It's just a data wall is a really great way to describe it. I have it broken down. I'm looking at different charts. Some things are broken down by different subgroups. We've analyzed that. We've actually started a kind of a data enterprise, I guess, of our own here, where we're trying to set up one shared Google Doc for every single student we have in the district K-12 that keeps track of every piece of data that we've ever collected on them from a testing standpoint. We're about 45% of the students we have already loaded into it. So any student, or any teacher or anybody here can click on that student and learn everything we know about them from any desktop in the whole district.
Wow. That's really making data visible, and it also sounds like there aren't individual student names or anything on your wall, that it's more charts and graphs of summary data. Yep,
all of mine is summary data.
A picture is worth 1,000 words, really. So at this time, I'd like to pass the ball back to Tina, who's going to share with us a really interesting project on building data literacy through collaborative approaches, working with small schools in Montana.
Thanks, Nettie. I just want to say to Randy, gosh, I wish I could be in your office, because I think the conversations you and I could have about your data walls and where we go and thinking about help other people do this, what a cool thing. So Nettie asked me to share a little bit about what we've done at Montana State as a land-grant university. It's our job to go out and serve the people of the state of Montana. And so in doing that, folks in our education department at MSU frequently write Title II grants from the Commissioner of Higher Ed office. And so in the last couple of years, we've written 2 grants. Specifically last year, our grant dealt with working with 3 separate, very small school districts in the eastern part of Montana, actually in the Bakken area. It involved about 80 teachers and paraprofessionals from these 3 schools. And a novel thing about doing this was we met with the districts prior to the year that we worked with them and got them to agree to change their school calendars for the year so that we could take advantage of some joint PIR days and early release training so that all 3 of those schools could come together and we could have one big fun data literacy party with all 3 of those schools. And so that's kind of how we began this work out in eastern Montana. So what did we do? Well, first of all, on one of our joint PIR days that we had, we started by splitting up all the folks into, first of all, some role-alike groups. So we had, for instance, all the primary teachers, K through 2, gathered together, and we had all of the secondary science teachers gathered together. And that, to some people, that might not sound like too big a deal, but you have to understand these schools are all mostly single-track schools, and so there is only one 3rd grade teacher, there is only one science teacher. So being able to get together with people from, you know, science teachers from the other schools was really a great thing for these folks. So we used we did some role-alike work, and we also split into groups that were very specific to just the schools to do some other kinds of work. So some of, I guess another thing that we did, I need to back up, we, like Randy talked about using data walls, we displayed data all over one of the cafeterias. We had probably 9 or 10 pieces of data scattered all over that we used with these groups going through and doing some data walks, some data carousels, so that they could specifically talk about what was going on with the data that they saw posted. Now, we were really careful not to use any data from those schools because we didn't want anyone to feel kind of uneasy about their students' performance if they wouldn't think it was high enough or whatever. So we had very realistic data, but we did not use data from those specific schools. So I think it made teachers feel like they could talk more openly about the trends they saw or whatever, and not think that they were going to hurt anyone else's feelings. So mainly our activities focused on the following things. We tried to get people to figure out, first of all, so where are we? Where are we in this specific data set? So what is this data set that's posted on this wall? Tell us about what our students are doing. Then we looked at specific kinds of things like, so looking at some of these data sets, what do we see are our biggest needs? Needs specifically to classrooms, but also projecting those needs from classrooms to the school level. Then we looked at things like, so realistically, what kinds of resources do our schools have? And how do we think about these issues and resources from a strengths-based perspective rather than thinking about them from a deficit-based? So we really tried to get people to look at what are we doing well? And let's not just focus on you know, what our problems are necessarily, but let's think about our strengths, because I think everybody can get behind, first of all, feeling good about we're doing something well, and then wanting to build on that. That's a much easier mindset for people to adopt than just always thinking about something that you need to change. So we really did have people look at opportunities later, and in terms of what little kinds of changes could we make that would make them move forward. So again, you know, part of our strategy was to really make our data visible. We wanted to turn data analysis from drudgery to a fun and interesting activity. So we made use, like I said before, of charts, graphs, posted climate surveys and things like that. And I guess that's another thing. We didn't just use numbers. We put up climate surveys. We put up all kinds of qualitative data, you know, done with descriptive statistics that talked about people's attitudes, because that's a part of data analysis too. It's not just about numbers. When we worked in multi-school or grade level teams or subject teams, we used that specific content knowledge to share ideas so that primary teachers could talk about what was working with them relative to diagnosing reading issues, or the secondary teachers could talk about how they see student writing. We found that what was happening, and it was great to see, was the isolation that rural teachers feel so often, being the only teacher in the school, or the only third grade teacher in the school, that really started to dissipate. And actually one of our goals for this program was to really try to create some networks of people out in the Bakken area or out in eastern Montana. We wanted those networks to really hold firm so that when teachers had a question about things, and once our team left, they could call each other in the neighboring community and talk, meet, go over things, share ideas. That was a great thing. It was wonderful to see that. Finally, we really looked at some school-wide concerns, and we tried to get people to look at data and think about data and what they were doing in terms of goal setting. So looking at this data, even though it's not necessarily our school data, if it were, what kinds of goals would we set and how would we think about getting there? So as we went through this process, we were really focused on data. And what began to emerge in terms of unexpected findings for us was that really this thing about data analysis really turned into, the focus became about assessments. And so what we found really highlighted the quality of assessments. It highlighted whether or not these assessments that people were using were even somewhat aligned to their curriculum or what they felt their teachers were teaching. And in a lot of cases, what we began to learn was that there was really some misalignment between the assessments that they were using and their curricula, some of the state standards, and basically what they were doing in schools. And so, like I said, this started as a data analysis workshop, and we wanted to get them skills in data literacy. But where our next steps came through from that was that we need to back up, and we need to really find some assessments that are better linked and better aligned to what it is that they want to accomplish and what the state standards say. And we also need to set up some schedule for assessments, because we found that a lot of times their assessments weren't frequent enough, or if they were frequent, they were mistimed so that data couldn't even really impact their instruction. So, our whole reason for doing this began as a data analysis, and really our next steps with these groups has really narrowed down to more of an assessment analysis and trying to promote better assessments with these schools. So, I guess the implication from this really is that the collaborative activities are really the way to go. You cannot analyze data, as I don't believe, as a school without doing it together. And whether you do it across the school, whether you do it in grade levels, whether you team with other schools like we did in this case with the small schools, whether you do it within schools, you have the opportunity to build stronger teams. You have the opportunity to use everybody's brain. You have the opportunity to make better decisions by using these collaborative activities. And so, I really believe that that's what we should be stressing to schools who want to do better and use better data. So, again, for us, our next steps are really to figure out how to better align what's taught with what's assessed, to realize, too, that the more rigorous our assessments are, the better chance we have of increasing our instructional rigor. And so we really need to spend time making sure that we are using quality assessments. We need to understand and emphasize that our assessments, that really has to be our focus. And if we don't have good enough ones, we need to figure out how to get better ones, whether we write those ourselves, whether we go to commercial assessments, whatever it is. But that's pretty much what our group has found, and it's been a great journey for us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Tina. And thank you, Randy. I think at this time we're going to move to our question and answer period. We've got 20 minutes, so we've got a good amount of time. So Terry and Randy, Tina and Randy, sorry, I believe you are both unmuted, so we should be able to hear both of you. Let me just ask one question, and I think I'll direct this one to Tina to start off. This is a question from Bend, Oregon that a participant actually included in the registration process. And the question comes back, Tina, to the assessments. And it sounded like from your presentation that you all were working with primarily sort of in-class assessments, formative and summative. And this participant is curious about whether there are different approaches to developing data literacy for different types of assessment. So, for example, if you're using an assessment to screen for placement, either into, say, special education or advanced placement, gifted and talented. What about progress monitoring, something that's just kind of over time, looking at a student's progress, particularly in response to a particular intervention? And, just other diagnostics within reading and math. Are you finding at all from your groups that there may be different approaches or different types of skills that would be needed to be developed?
I don't necessarily think so, but I guess I would go back to that alignment issue, because some of the schools we were working with, had a pretty detailed process, if you will, for screening and progress monitoring and things, but still what was happening was that they weren't catching everyone. And I think that was really due to the fact that I think there was some misalignment between those assessments, whether they were screening assessments, whether they were progress monitoring assessment. I think there was misalignment between that assessment or those assessments and what they were actually doing in the classroom. So I guess, the first thing I would say is that I think alignment is important no matter what assessment you're using, whether it's a screening assessment, whether it's progress monitoring, whether it's a summative assessment that we use at the end of the year that looks at our ability to accomplish the state standards. I think that's huge. And I think the other piece of that is, in terms of process, I know schools where, where some of the decision making about how students are placed resides in maybe the principal's office or in the counselor's office. And I guess I would believe that to make our entire school aware of student issues, that would be better done in collaborative groups. And so I guess for that, I would say I don't really think there's much reason to do different kinds of processes relative to analysis.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you for that insight. And so really focusing on alignment, no matter what kind of assessment you're using, it's the assessment to the goal or the purpose, and those two things being aligned. Terrific. So we'd like to invite other questions that are coming in, and I think that this question could be directed to both Randy and Tina. It's in rural schools. We typically, and I think, Tina, you referred to this in your earlier remarks, we typically have many singletons, lone teachers in a grade level or content area who don't have like teachers to collaborate with. So how do you overcome that obstacle? And I'd like Tina to speak to this first, but Randy, if you could be thinking about the notion of collaboration and whether that's something that you integrated into your approach as you were moving your school forward. So Tina, do you want to start?
Sure, thanks, Nettie. One of the things that we did, and we even suggested to people to do after we left, was in those singleton schools where there was only, one third grade teacher, one fourth grade teacher, one strategy to really continue to look at data, and the important thing is the conversation, and not just what the numbers say, but the conversation about, so what do we do about it? So we would actually give the third grade teacher, the fourth grade teacher's data, or the fifth grade teacher's data we gave to the second grade teacher. And so we made them look at data with different eyes. And the things that they came up with that were different from what, the second grade teacher, for instance, saw, I think revealed a lot about how easily we can get sucked into this notion of we know our kids. And So that was, that was huge for us.
Great. Randy, do you have any thoughts along these lines?
Yeah, actually, the example that Tina gave of the younger age teachers, we've tackled that problem a different way. We had our kindergarten teacher and our first grade teacher and maybe 2 second grade teachers, and so then you end up with siloing where they can't really become a team as easily if they all were teaching the same thing. So we do multi-age instruction. Now I have 8 teachers, 8 of whom teach K-1-2 classrooms. So it's multi-age, 3 grades in a classroom, and then I have 8 teachers and they all teach 3, 4, 5 kids, 3rd, 4th, 5th grade kids. And then I have 8 teachers and they all teach 6, 7, 8. So now I have 3 groups of 8 teachers who can share data about all of those kids, and they do that all of the time. And then at the high school, same thing. We don't have 5 different science teachers. We really have 2 now. But to try to make a commonality so everyone could talk about the same thing, that's one reason why we went to AP for All. So now everyone is an AP teacher, and they have that commonality, and it's a way to bring us together in a professional learning community and talk about in this case, our AP data.
Great. Randy, did you have any teachers who just refused to become an AP teacher? I'm just curious whether there was resistance around that.
Yeah, there was a massive resistance when we went to AP for All. The first 3 years that I talked about, I started with the willing. So teachers who were willing to do it and students and families who were willing to do it. The huge resistance came when we went to AP for All that first year, and it was from my then single English teacher and then the single social studies teacher, and they wrote me a huge treatise, 5 pages long, single-space typed, on why this was the worst idea possible and how it was going to destroy everything. And we talked a whole awful lot and shared data, and finally I convinced them to just try it. And then 3 years later, that same English teacher wrote a letter back to himself describing how wrong he was. But it took a lot of one-on-one to get past some of those staff barriers.
Yeah. So your combination of leadership and data and sort of dogged persistence, it sounds like.
Yep.
And really just keeping a relationship and communicating with people and inviting them to just try it and see how it works. Yeah, terrific. And
basically try it and see how it works and use the data to decide if it really was working, which became pretty evident quickly that, like, the world didn't end, and actually more kids were getting more college credit under this version, so why wouldn't we just keep ramping it up?
Right, yeah, I mean, the fact that you included so many kids in AP courses and your pass rate did not decrease at all. That's just amazing. So we have a few more questions and a few more minutes. So this question, just reading it here, I think I'll ask both of you to respond to. And Tina, maybe you first. The question is, what about teacher best practices for communicating data to students? What are the most effective types of data for teachers to display on classroom data walls, particularly for student progress monitoring and goal setting? So this has to do with really empowering students to see and interact with their own data. Have you all, Tina, come across that piece yet in your project or in your research?
Not necessarily in my research, but as I was a middle school principal, we had a math initiative that we were trying to raise our math scores, and so one of the things that we knew we were weak at was fractions, of course, and ratios in our middle school. And so we set that as a goal, and we had started playing these math games and these fractions, specifically about fractions and things. And we did that several times a week, and we progress monitored that. in every single classroom. So the PE teachers did it. We did it all across the entire school at the same time. PE teachers did it, and we had these thermometers up everywhere that kids could see. And once we reached our goal, you know, we had a party and we did things, you know, fun things like that. But what we found out was kids were really interested in their individual progress. And a lot of kids would go back to their math teachers to ask, okay, well, I know how I'm doing at this. What do you think I'm good at now? Or what can I get better at? And so, again, back to those visual displays, I think that's just a continual reminder of where we are and where we want to be. And I think it holds kids accountable. They get to be a part in setting those goals. They get to be a part in watching themselves reach it. It's really empowering. And, you know, I think that's a great strategy to use.
Great. Yeah, I've found with students and even my own daughter that that kind of visibility and goal setting can really increase engagement, and not just for younger kids, but for middle school and high school students as well. Randy, how about you? Are you all engaging students at all directly in their data?
Of course, you know, when you have a lot of people working in the building, it happens differently in each classroom. I do see evidence of that, particularly with our math teachers. And in middle school, remember, every teacher teaches math because they're teaching everything. It's a classroom generalist model. So they are really great at pre-tests at the beginning of the year, and then hitting those same topics, those same tests 3 or 4 times a year, so the students can gauge their own progress. My advanced math teacher in the high school is religious about that type of thing. Going into each year, he has detailed every set of skills that the students are going to need to know. They do an assessment at the beginning and establish the baseline, and then they keep track of it on a weekly, if not daily basis for every single student.
Great. Thank you. We have a couple more questions, and this one I'm also going to direct to both of you. I'll ask Randy to speak to this first, I think. Are you seeing increases in numbers of English learners in the rural districts that you work with? And how are you addressing their needs to be assessed appropriately? And do you have adequate resources to support teachers who are working with English learners? Andy?
I'll answer the last part first. We don't have adequate resources, period. And yes, we are seeing an increase. We really didn't have any ELD students in the district as early as 5 years ago. And last year was the first year I hired a full-time ELD teacher. So it's growing fairly dramatically. We're trying to allocate resources to those students and address those needs. It has been interesting from the data standpoint, because for so many years, all of those subset groups we just never had more than 2 or 3 students, and so it was never we would never pull out data and look at those subsets of English language learners at all, and now it's something that we really have to focus on. So it's a challenge.
Sounds like staying on top of it and having a routine around it. Tina, do you have anything to add to that?
You know, I think our context in Montana is a little bit different. I think that we do have some ELL students in some of our larger communities and our larger population centers. But in Montana, when we think about students who may not have English as their first language, we think about our students on our reservations. And a lot of those kids grow up in a different tradition, oral tradition, than what we speak in school. And so when you factor that in, yeah, there are a lot of schools around Montana who have tons of students who English is not their first language. And, you know, that's an issue all unto its own on our reservation schools. Right.
A couple more questions. We have about 5 more minutes, so let me throw these out and invite crisp answers. So with restricted resources, what would you recommend as the most important data collection sources or processes to invest in or to start with? So where should you start? What should the priorities be in terms of data and data collection? Randy, do you want to start with that?
Yeah, I'll start with that. Actually, the whole change from Corbett was prompted by restricted resources. Our funding was going away very quickly, and the data that we looked at was just what we were being successful at, and like I said before, we were being pretty unsuccessful at almost everything when we looked at the data back then. Before we did that part, though, we had to decide on our focus. And I think your focus is going to help dictate what data sets you look at. So when our focus turned into college, then the data that we collected was data that was going to be collected, that data that was going to drive students towards that goal. If, like I said before, if we had decided to become the best ag school, the data that we would have started collecting would have been far different than what we began with 12 years ago. So I know that was kind of a vague answer, but I think you have to decide what your goal is first before you decide what data to pick.
Very good. Hannah, do you have anything to add to that in terms of the most important piece?
Yeah, I agree with Randy, and I would say that, I think a lot of schools kind of look at maybe not even so much where they are, but they don't know what necessarily to do. So the first thing they think they should do is go out and buy some kind of an assessment. And I would say that really they need to look more deeply at what they have right now and what the data that they have available right now, what does that tell them? And then, once they really deeply understand that, I think then there's room to make the decisions about, do we need more, do we need less, do we need different? But I guess, I would really say, look at what you have presently, use the model of collaborative inquiry, and get to know your data from a very deep level.
Got it. So we're ending with a tough question, and again, I'm going to invite crisp answers, and I'm going to start with Randy. I'm hoping, Randy, that you may have faced this and might have a response. So this participant is asking about a data issue that is particular to small schools, because small schools have so few students that one student, a change in the status of one student might really show either huge improvement or huge lack of improvement in your aggregate data. So the concern is that, data, we really want to use it to boil down information and to tell a story, but potentially in these cases, it might be just, what people are seeing and experiencing before their very eyes, which is the movement of one particular student. Do you have a response to that or a way to approach that?
Yeah, I do. It's definitely a problem. You can get your third grade scores back one year, and they could be wildly different from the third grade scores the next year, even though you haven't changed a thing. It's just simply an artifact of small numbers and different cohorts, which can be influenced by just a few students. So when I present data, I often group it in big clusters across multiple years. I even did that with the SAT data that I shared in this particular presentation. I grouped them together in 4 or 5 year increments, so we got enough data points in there that we aren't being a victim of the law of small numbers, where one kid can influence it dramatically. I think that's the best advice I can give for small districts, is try to group across years when possible. We're lucky enough now with AP data that I am generating huge numbers each year, with 1,000 data points. That's plenty for us to look at.
Terrific. Tina, any other response to that?
I agree with Randy. I think it's really important to look at trends. And, in a very small school, I think trends over time are important. But I also think it's important to look at, if you're looking at math scores, for instance, I think it's important to look at math scores not only at sixth grade level from year to year to year, but through all the levels to see if you can see trends through all the levels year to year. Do you notice that at a certain time, you know, at a certain grade level, there's a dip and then again there's a rise? Sometimes these things become really evident over several years. And so yeah, that trend analysis is really important. And I guess the last thing I'd say is really depends on what it is that you want out of your data. We know that we need to look at individual students. That's very important. So if we do have, you know, scores that go down, we need to look at those students and try to figure out what's going on with them. But we also need to keep that in mind relative to the bigger issues about what does instruction look like? You know, is our curriculum well aligned to our assessments? Are we meeting our standards? So I think you look at it from a couple different lenses.
Wonderful. So we do have a couple more questions, and my wonderful communications associate is suggesting that perhaps we stay on the line for a few more minutes, but let me first ask Randy and Tina, are you all able to give us a few more minutes, say 5 more minutes?
Sure.
Sure.
Okay, great. So Randy, participant is curious about what software you're using to track data.
I'm actually, we use my high school principal who's creating that I guess software that I talked about all by himself. So this is literally a homegrown endeavor that he started in on his own. It is all just, you know, it's just all a Google platform. He's using all Google, everything available is Google.
Yep. Having people who can write code and know their way around that is, yeah, that's a nice capacity to have on your staff.
It is fairly typical rural, right? Like, so the high school principal is actually, you know, being the tech guy, of course.
The IT head, yep. Yeah, and we also had a participant who, Tina, was curious about the names of the schools that you're working with. I think I would invite that participant to contact you directly for that information. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Okay. So the question that I think came up a little bit earlier, but I want to put it out there again, about FERPA concerns with sharing and visualizing data. For example, teachers share data insights while learning how their kids were doing. And FERPA allows teachers to see their students' data, but not all students. So that's a tough issue in small districts. Interesting question. Who would like to start out with that? Randy?
Sure. One way that we get around, I guess, FERPA, or it's just a construct of how we build our school. Like in this middle school, I have these 8 classroom generalists, and they have their own room with, you know, 30 kids per teacher. But also, every kid in the school spends some time, some sort of instruction with every other teacher in the school somehow. Like we will swap for PE and we swap for enrichment. And that way, every kid is every teacher's responsibility, and so then they can see the data. We don't do that nearly as much in our primary grades or elementary, but in the middle school, we try to make every kid everybody's responsibility, so each kid really has 8 teachers.
Got it. And how about you, Tina? Anything that you're learning from your sites about working with the FERPA regulations?
Sure, and this may be kind of an easy cop-out, but, you know, you scrub the data to the point that the names are off, but maybe you just have the student identifier. And kind of hard to memorize 9-digit numbers a lot, so, you know, I think that's a really easy way to get around it.
Great. All right. So I think we're going to end there. I want to really thank Tina Versland and Randy Trainey, our presenters today, for just the depth of knowledge and experience that you're bringing to this work. We've had a number of folks who've stayed with us past our hour. Another testament to how really important this topic is and how important it is for us to get together in venues like this to ask questions and share experiences. So thank you, Randy and Tina, very much. And there's your contact information in case anyone else would like to follow up with you. Also, as folks exit the webinar, I really encourage you to please fill out the survey that is either going to be emailed to you after the event if you're allowing us to email you, or will pop up on your screen as soon as you exit the webinar. So it only takes a few minutes, and we really appreciate your feedback. All right, so Randy and Tina, thank you again. Thank you, Andy, for your technical assistance, and I hope everyone has a wonderful rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Nettie, for having us.
Yep, thank you.
Thank you.